In today's video, I'm gonna show you how you can make a Transformers effect inside your house. You don't need anything besides maybe an iPhone or a camera and Blender on your computer and just a little bit of knowledge, not much, because even if an idiot like myself can do it, so can you. Sup you phonies, how's it going? Welcome to another video, and I'm very excited about today's effect because I always wanted to make my own little transformer effect, and now with a little bit of Blender knowledge, 3D knowledge rather, anybody can do that really from home, which is cool, and I'm gonna show you how. Well, first of all, I did not make the model nor the animation myself. I downloaded it from Sketchfab. In order to do that, you need a Sketchfab account and then find the model. You don't have to find the model anymore because there you go, I have it for you. I'm gonna link the model and the animation in the description so you don't have to do anything, just download it. Once you have your model, the other thing you need is a video, because we are implementing this transformer effect into real life footage. And in order to do that, you need to record this footage yourself. Yes, I could just provide my video to you, but where would be the fun at that? You need to make your own video so you can put the transformer into your bedroom, into your living room, on your mom's head, wherever you want to put it, you can do that. You just have to record it on your own device. When you record it, let's say on your iPhone, make sure to record in a lower frame rate, like 24 frames per second or maybe 30 frames, but don't do 60 frames or more, because every single frame you record you're also gonna need to render, which is gonna take longer, so keep that in mind and shoot in a lower frame rate, but of course not too low. Don't go lower than 24. Once you recorded your footage, you have to open Blender. I use Blender 4.1, but any Blender version 2.8 or newer will do. So once you have Blender open, this is my default setup, what I see. Yours probably looks different. And the first thing I do is I have, like, this is my camera view. When I look through my camera, this is what I see. And on the bottom here, I have my viewport. On my left here, I have my shader editor. On my top left, I have my HDRIs. That's how I have it set up. If you want to add or remove windows, you can do it with right click in between here and vertical split or horizontal split, and then you can make more windows. Anywho, let's start with the effect. So I usually start my 3D effects with a person just for scale references. Since my transformer is going to be a miniature, this is not going to help me much for scale references, so I'm just going to delete him. I'm gonna import another model, something which is smaller, like those tinted glasses, for example, because those glasses could also be on the table, and I actually do have glasses or shades in my video, which is gonna make it easier to understand the scale of my transformer. Anywho, let's get going. The first step is we need to 3D track our footage. For that, I'm gonna go to my motion tracking tab. If you don't have it open here, just hit on plus, VFX, and motion tracking. In here, we have three different windows, or four rather. We have our 3D camera, we have a timeline up here, we have a timeline up here, and this is where the actual magic happens, the 3D track. So I'm gonna open a video, which is gonna be right here. This is my video. In order to watch it smoothly, click on prefetch and set scene frames. This is going to load your video into the RAM and you can actually watch it smoothly. Now, the next job is going to be the trickiest probably, is to track our footage. So first we need to analyze it. What do we have here? We definitely have a change in location, so I would stick with location. But if only the perspective is changing, or you can use maybe affine also, then you can use those too, but I'm gonna use location. Under the tracking settings, you have a few presets, and I usually use, if it's a very fast motion, I use fast motion obviously, but if it's just like random footage, I use blurry footage, and that's going to change the pattern size and the search size of my trackers, but you can play around with that. And I usually also hit normalize. Now, let's just go from frame number 1 and see how it goes. Make sure you're frame number 1, not frame number 0. And now detect features. Now it automatically created a few trackers, and they're not all going to be great, but you're going to see in a second. Like for example, this one is a reflection, this one is not going to work, just like this one is a reflection, this one is not going to work, just like that one. And this one is actually just from the perspective, yeah, this is a great track, the contrast is good, but once the camera is going to be moving, this is going to be shifting, so this is also not a good tracking marker. So I'm just going to delete the ones where I already see those are not going to work. Great. If we were satisfied now, we're going to select them all with A and go on this button here, track markers forward. Now just track the entire footage forward. Now we can see if it actually is a good track or not. Here I see this track is like a little far out. I'm just going to double check it. Oh, because it's moving, it's being blocked by the Coke can, then of course I can't use this one, so I'm just going to delete this track. In the end, the more you have, the better, but you actually need only 8 good tracking points. And most importantly, somewhere where you want to put your 3D model, this is where you want to have also trackers, like this one for example. This could be my origin. So just from one track we can go to solve and try to maybe turn on focal length if you don't know your focal length, turn on keyframe, and then solve camera movement or self camera motion. And right now we have a solve error of 236, which is way too high. And there's 2 things we can do about it. Most importantly, maybe delete tracks which are not great, or maybe just our keyframes, they're just not great. Maybe if we just pick our keyframes ourselves, maybe it's gonna be better. So I'm just gonna pick 340 and maybe 100. Solve camera motion again, and already we have solve error of 15 now. So definitely this tracker, it doesn't belong here because it's like moving around all weird. So we don't want this one. So I'm just gonna delete a few frames or the few trackers which just don't do what I want them to do. And in this blue line here we can see the track. The smoother this line, the better. Okay, let's create a few more trackers. So we're going to go to the very last frame, go and track again, detect features, and now we're just going to track those features backwards. We can even go to the very middle, detect features, go to the front, go to the same frame, and track backwards. So now we have way more trackers. And now we can just delete the ones we see. Okay, this one is crazy, I'm just going to delete that one, delete this one, delete this one, and keep deleting until you feel like, okay, this is actually getting closer to be a good track. Something you can always do is go and clean up and filter tracks, and now you can filter tracks with a high error threshold. So let's just go on 3. Okay, no tracks are selected on 3, so let's go a little lower than that and just delete those. And now if we solve camera motion again, we got a better result. And even sometimes it's just one track which destroys the entire track. So just keep deleting bad tracks and just make new ones until you have a satisfying track. You can even track certain points yourself. When you see some good points in your shot where you can tell, okay, they are basically through the entire video constantly in the shot, then you can just set a marker yourself. Like for example, this here, this point, and just hold Control left click, and now I just made a marker, and now I'm just going to track it forward, and it's basically in my shot through the entire time, and that's going to help you track too. And when you're satisfied, the next step is you have to set your origin. So I'm going to just set my origin where this headphone is. So just click on it, set origin. Now from the origin, I want to set my axis. So I don't have a marker right here, but I have one here. So I'm just going to make this my y-axis. I can also click on set as background and also set up tracking scene, because now in my viewport here I already have my track. Now you can see it's like all over the place, so I just have to set my grounds. You just hold shift and select 3 markers which are the ground and hit on floor. Now you can see our camera is aligned. We're gonna see in a second if it's perfectly aligned, but mostly our job here is done. Now we're just gonna go on layout. This is my regular layout, and see how my scene is aligned. And I can see when I click on my camera, I can see my markers here. So now I can see if they're actually touching the ground properly everywhere. Like this one is a little too high, rather too low, but more or less it works. So now we have one issue. You see how my glasses I added before, how small they are? they should have the same size like these glasses. So I need to adjust the scale. So I'm going to go back to my motion tracking. Now I have to select two markers where I believe I kind of know the distance, which this could be around 20 centimeters or so. So I'm just going to point to and set the scale, and that looks way better. Just a wild guess. Also, it doesn't have to be perfect because we don't know how big the transformer actually is going to be, but that works pretty good. Now I'm going to go back to layout, and you see how close we are to the ground, and the scale, all that fits pretty good. Now when you set up your scene like this, it automatically creates a few objects and folders you don't really want. So we're just going to delete the light here. We don't want this light. Also, the ground layer is going to go to our upper collection. We'll delete the background collection. We're also not going to need the glasses anymore. So we only have our ground, and you can see how nicely our camera is moving around our subject. We don't have a subject, but around our scene, and that's exactly how my real camera was moving too, because I was doing this. Now this big plane here on the ground, this is going to be my shadow catcher, or even a reflection catcher. I don't believe we're going to see reflections here, but this is definitely going to be for our shadows. So what I'm going to do is just scale it down. This is going to be our first modeling job. Scale it to the exact size of my table. I'm going to rotate it, move it just like that. So I'm just aligning it with the edges of my table. Just going to extrude it down a little. Now I can even bevel the edges so it aligns with the round table. Again, it's just a shadow catcher, doesn't have to be perfect, just more or less. And that's basically it. Now, while you have this selected, make sure go on Object, Visibility, that shadow catcher is selected. In Eevee, you're not going to see a difference, but in Cycles, it's actually gonna, if we add a light in here, it's actually just going to be invisible only when we have an object here. Let me just import a cylinder. So our object is not going to receive any lights like this. It will receive lights. It's only going to receive shadows. Now let's go in our camera settings. Make sure your camera is selected, camera settings, and go on background images, and make sure that it's the opacity is on 100 so we can actually see it nicely. Okay, now it's time to find ourselves an HDRI which kind of matches our scene. We can set up the lighting ourselves, but I think it does make a lot of sense to use an HDRI. If you don't have Polyhaven, I really highly encourage you. If you don't have Polyhaven, I highly encourage you to get it. It is for free. It has some models, but mostly it has HDRIs, a big variety of HDRIs, different scenes, inside, outside, night, day, all kinds of different HDRIs. And you can even select it here, like indoor, studio, high contrast. So that's the kind of HDRI I'm looking for here, because I have one window on the other side. I can just import it here, and now when I look in my shading, I can see, okay, it's actually lit. Of course, not the wrong orientation. It's lit from this direction. So I'm just looking at my shadows. That's why it's good to have a model in here, so you can look at the shadows. And if you don't want to see your HDRI, which you most likely you don't want to see it, just go in your render settings and hit under film, you hit transparent. Now it's just not visible. And I just picked the cylinder here because the cylinder has a similar shape like my Coke here. So when I compare those two objects, like shadow wise, I can actually try to align those two shadows or make them as similar as possible. And one more thing before you start scrolling around here, because you are going to destroy your track, make sure before you do that, go under view with N. You can open this, go under view and turn this off, camera to view. Now when you zoom in and zoom out, you're not going to destroy your track. So now technically your ground doesn't need a material because it's not going to be visible like this because it's a shadow catcher, right? But I highly encourage you to do one extra step. Let's give it a new material, and under the material settings we're going to give it a image texture. We open a video, this video, because now when we connect it to the base color, it's actually going to reflect our video onto our object, which can make the difference when it comes to realism. In order to do that, just select your video, hit Ctrl T, it's going to open those two nodes and just go from window to vector. This is one thing you have to do, and then instead of repeat, you just mirror it. Now let's say I'm going to give my object here also a material, just random, go down with the roughness, metallic up, and now you can see how it reflects our environment on our objects, and that's very cool, which can really help to sell an effect. Now I'm just going to use this cylinder here just to make my shadows and reflections proper. So right now this shadow is a little long, it's going in a little different direction than my Coke shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my world settings, and the HDRI I'm using, I'm just going to rotate it in the right direction so it's like parallel to this. I can even move this object closer so I can see better. So those two shadows just go into the same direction. And my HDRI has two light sources, which is not a huge deal. I guess it's like this light and this light. So I might just try to do a different HDRI. Now to soften up the shadows, you can just make a new light or shift a light, area light, then just position it properly that it comes from the direction, which does make sense. Now under the light settings, you can even adjust the color so it's more like the color in your room, and increase the brightness until the shadows are more or less as dark as the real shadows. And if you do want extra reflection, don't do it in the shadow catcher. This is our shadow catcher. Just make a new plane, bring it where you need the reflections. Gonna give it a new material, bring the roughness down, metallic up. Now we can see how much of reflection do we actually need. And again, I'm comparing this reflection with the real reflection, so I'm just going to bring up the roughness, make it metallic down until it basically looks just like the real reflection right here. Now we did all the setting up. Now it's actually time to place our transformer. So for that, like I said, download the file I said earlier, and that's basically what it looks like. Then you just open the blend file. In that particular case, you have a few different models, and you can just pick one of them. For the animation you already saw, I use this one on the left, but for the current one, I'm just going to use this one here. So I'm just going to select this entire thing. Make sure you do select this entire thing. So click on that, right click, or select hierarchy, copy this, Control C. Now I'm going to go to my original Blender scene and paste. Now this is going to be gigantic and out of scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a empty, and that empty we can move our object around. Don't move the object itself, you could run into trouble. So just make Shift A and empty. Any empty will do. I'll just make a box, scale it up big enough that our transformer is going to fit in there. It doesn't have to fit in there, it just makes it visually easier, just like that. Now I'm going to select the robot, then I'm going to shift select my empty, hold Control P on the keyboard, object keep transform. Now when I move my empty only, I'm going to move both. See, it works perfectly. Now I can scale the empty down and bring it to the actual position where it belongs. So just keep scaling down until it has the right size. Mine is like really small, so it really depends on your scene how big you want it to be, but that's basically my size. And since this animation is moving, make sure it's not walking all over like the real objects here. So I definitely have to even make it smaller, because it's doing like this backhand spraying thing, and then it transforms into a car. And move it away from the other objects a little bit, just like that. I can even rotate it if I want to. Just make sure it is on the ground and not hovering, because that would ruin the entire effect. So zoom in here, make sure it's like sitting in the ground. Once you're happy with your position and it still doesn't look photoreal perfect, there's still a few things we can do. Now the shadow should be perfectly aligned, but again the material just looks too saturated, too sharp. That's why it's always good to have references in your scene, like this pink and this pink. If I try to adjust this color more like this color, like this plastic here, then it would look more real. And the way I'm going to do that, I'm just going to click on this model and see how the material are set up. And I can see that again in my shader editor. And okay, this is my color here. So if I just, let's say I decrease the roughness a little, decrease the metallic a little, maybe increase the roughness. Let's make a new node. Let's try color ramp. Hue and saturation. Plug this in between the material and the base color. If I just decrease the saturation just a little, already looks better. Maybe even make it darker or brighter. I could even change the color completely if I wanted to, but I'm gonna do that in the end. So I'm just trying to adjust it. So right now it's also way too shiny. And see how shiny this is? It is a little shiny, but not too much. So that I can control either with the metallic, just go down with the metallic, or just increase the roughness a little. And already it looks definitely better. You see the difference? Another trick, what I like to do is I have a few imperfection maps, but you can also download those from the internet. So I use an image texture and open a new texture, go on your asset wherever you have it installed, imperfection maps and scratches. So this is basically what it looks like. So you can adjust those, make it the size you would like. And when you plug this into the roughness, you're gonna get some cool scratches on your character, which gives it a few imperfections. If you want to make them more visible, make a new color ramp node and just increase the contrast, and it just gives it more imperfections. And we are almost done here. One more thing I like to do is turn on depth of field. In a shot like that, there is not much depth of field, but there is. You can see how more out of focus the background is instead of the foreground. So we can simulate that too. So all we have to do for that is, I'm going to bring my 3D cursor here and I'm going to make a new empty. Let's use an arrow, make it small so it's only there so we can see it. Now under my camera settings, you can click here for your camera settings, go down to depth of field, turn it on, and under focus object, I'm going to use this empty I just created, so the focus is going to stay here at all times. In reality, the focus probably shifts. The focus probably was like on here or the Coke can. It's very hard to tell, but if it's hard to tell for us, it's also hard to tell for the viewer. I'm going to add another RGB node in the material to just decrease the contrast a little, because our video is not as contrasty as the materials here. So I'm just going to decrease the contrast with the curves just to adjust it a little. Again, I'm looking at those colors and those colors to just match it a little. By the way, you can always increase and decrease the emission of, this little glow here. You can decrease that if you want. I think I turned it completely off, but you can do that under the emission settings. Now when you believe you're done, the next step is we have to organize our files a little. So this here is our reflection, which we probably not gonna need. So let's ignore that for now. This here is my shadow, which we are gonna need. This shadow here, very important. What we're going to need to do with the shadow is we're going to bring this shadow into a new collection, call it a shadow collection, because what we're trying to do is render all those layers separately. So even like reflection, let's move it into a new collection, call it reflection collection. And this model here is just going to stay in the foreground, which is fine. So now we're also going to make different scenes. We have one for the foreground, one for the shadows. Then we're also going to make another one for reflection. Again, I don't think we're going to need it, but just in case, I'm going to show you how to render the reflections separately. So now when we are on our foreground here, all we're going to do is when you click on this little arrow here, you need those arrow up indirect light only. We need this option here. What it does is now we can render everything in one layer, but for example, in the foreground section, I only want the reflection indirect only. So it's not going to show me the shadows here, not going to show the reflections here. So now when I switch to shadows, I only want foreground indirect only, and also the reflection indirect only. And now under reflection, the shadow is going to be indirect only, and the foreground is going to be indirect only. So it's just going to render the reflection in case you want it. Now we're not done here. Under the view layers, we have to turn on glossy, only indirect. So let's go to our compositor. So right now we have two render layers. Okay, well, let's just ignore everything else. We can just delete all those nodes. So we need three of those. We need one for the foreground, one for shadow, and we're just going to duplicate it, one for the reflection. So what we don't want to do is render those three things separately. So we're going to make a file output node, Shift A, file output, and our foreground image goes into the image. Now we need like two more sections here. So we're just going to click on this file output node, go on node, properties, and make two more of those. This one is going to be called shadow, and this one reflection. Shadow you spell with an A. So now under the reflection tab, I just take the glossy indirect only, this here. I'm just going to plug this into the reflection, under shadow, into shadow, and the foreground into image. We got that already. And in the file output node, we're just going to make a new folder. Let's call it tutorial render, except now let's just render one frame so we see what we got. So now we have three different layers. We have the foreground, we have the shadow, and reflection. Unfortunately, in the reflection we also see the reflection of the HDRI, and most likely you don't want this. You only want the reflection of your model. For that, go to your world settings, and this is your HDRI. Just hit tab to get into the menu. Now make a new file path node. No, it's a path node. Yeah, light path, that's what it's called. And a mix node, a mix color node, where the diffuse goes into the factor, and this goes into A, this goes into image. Now it's not gonna reflect your HDRI when you render. Okay, I'm gonna skip the render process because that would take a long time. Let's just jump into the scene I made before, but it's technically the same thing, and I'm gonna show you how to composite all of this in After Effects. So let's start over. First, I'm gonna make a new composition out of my video. This is just a video without any effects on it. Now when you double click, you can find your Transformers render under the folder where you rendered, render miniature, that's the one, and then you import your image and your shadows and your reflections separately. That looks like this. Now make sure when you click on your video and click on interpret footage and copy this number, because that's the exact frame rate we have to use for our image sequence we rendered out, for the image and for the shadow, and of course reflections if you need it. Now once you have the scene here, now I'm going to import my shadows and also import my image on top of each other. Now that alone looks good, but it's not perfect yet. You see how strong those shadows are, and it just doesn't look right. So let's work on it step by step. First thing is we're going to work on those shadows. The first step is duplicate your video. Okay, that's important. Have your video on top of each other twice. Now we're going to use this shadow as a mask for this video. So find the track matte, and we're going to use this video, track matte, the shadow layer. Now it's just going to disappear. Now we can color correct the video. So I'm just going to set curves, and now I can just adjust the curves until the shadows have the same color and look the same like the real shadows. This is a little too blue, so I can bring up the reds a little, see, until it looks like this. But just remember, even though this is a little warmer, it's also because this red reflects on the shadow, so it appears a little warmer. So maybe it's better to look at those shadows as a reference. And you see how soft they are? That's basically what we're trying to achieve here too. So just play with these colors until you're satisfied. And if your shadow is too harsh, you can just right click it, effect, blur and sharpen, Gaussian blur, and now you can just blur it a little if you want to. Now let's bring back our image. One trick is, which always is great, just hit T and just decrease the opacity. Just 2% or so, make it to 98. That already brings the image closer together. Now I'm comparing those colors, and honestly it does look very good, but just in case I'm gonna go on Effect, Color Correction, and Lumetri Color. We open the basic color, and now what we're gonna do is we set our white balance. So we're just gonna use this picker here and select something white in the scene, like this is white. It's probably not gonna make a huge difference, but it can, depending on your scene. Like for example, if I picked this as white, it would mess up everything. But of course I want to pick like something white in the scene like this, and that is gonna bring the white balance of my CG, match it with my real white balance. Now I still think my character has a little more contrast than the background, so I can just decrease the contrast a little until it matches better. Also, generally it's just too sharp. It's like perfectly sharp, so I'm just gonna reduce the sharpen just by a little. When you look at it, it's important to look very close, but also just zoom far out, because then you can see imperfections better sometimes. Now I'm just looking at some blacks, like for example, this is perfectly black here, and this is perfectly black. Even if I just move it temporarily, like right in front, do those blacks match? This one is a little darker, so I'm just gonna bring this black up a little until it matches perfectly, and then I can just bring it back to where it came from with the blacks adjusted. Like here the shadows are just too dark, so I can go back to the shadows and adjust them a little like that. And when you think you're happy, just make a new adjustment layer. You can give it a Lumetri color, just increase the contrast on everything and play with the numbers like just the way you would color grade any other video, and that's gonna also match the entire image better. Maybe give it a little vignettes, some imperfections. I always like to go into like color wheels and make the shadows a little green, highlights blue, maybe the midtones. Just don't overdo it, just a little bit, and you see the difference. It looks already better. Then I also like to give it another adjustment layer, and I put two effects on it. One is optic compensation. Set this number to 8. What it does is it basically curves my entire image. And then I also give it another effect called 3D glasses. The left eye, I set it to the adjustment layer I just created, and here under 3D view, set it into balanced colored red and blue. If you want to know more in detail what I'm doing right now, I made a whole video. You should check it out. It's going to be like in the end card, but I'm just rushing through it right now because I've done it in a different video. And then what you can do in addition to that is make a new layer, a null object, and parent all your videos to the null object. Now you can just zoom in and out of your footage, or even add a camera shake with Alt holding on the position stopwatch. Give it a wiggle, let's say 4,20. Now this entire image is just gonna add like a little extra camera shake. You can do the same thing to the rotation of your null object. Wiggle 2, 2, and now it's just going to rotate also, which gives it a little more realism. And again, you can animate the scale and the position manually too. Like let's say you wanted to move in here, I just created 2 keyframes, or 4 keyframes rather. It zooms in. We're staying here for a second. Now I'm gonna copy those, copy paste those, and zoom back out to whatever position. This is very random, whatever you think looks good, just to pretend whoever was filming was zooming in and out. It's a pretty cool effect you can do in addition to that. But make sure in the end to add motion blur. This is like the motion blur. Add this to all of your videos, to the entire image, to make it all feel very real. And if you do all that, this is the result. So I hope you liked my little video breakdown. If you have any questions, make sure to ask them in the comments, and see you in the next video. Toodaloo-doo.